entire character's animation segment in the frame by frame section when he bounces into frame and shakes his head, coming to attention, and kicks up and lands, we're now ready to tweak the animation. Now, when I talk about motion tweaks and polishing the final animation, I'm talking about smoothing out between the doubles of the frames. I'm talking about adding some follow through and some bounce back to the collisions, and I'm talking about adding subtle motion to the sections we have pre-divided ready to add some motions to. For example, here when we have the head and body separate, to add a sway to this character. So I'm going to go through from the very beginning, and the first example of how I create motion tweaks to refine and smooth out the motion would be in this sort of area where we have this downwards motion of the character going down. These are on doubles, and that's where every second frame is a new keyframe. But because we're playing at 24 frames per second, that means for a large duration of that segment, it's actually playing more at around 12 frames per second. Because on 20 frames per second, with only every second frame being used, we're cutting that in half. So what we can actually do, without creating a brand new in-between for every single pose, we can sort of trick the viewer into thinking that there is a very smooth frame-by-frame animation on every single frame. And we can do this by duplicating some of the keyframes and just moving them. So for example, selecting this layer with the monkey and the tail, I'm going to duplicate the keyframe and select my onion skin and only show the frame immediately before and after. And then I can tweak the monkey and drag him to be positioned exactly between these two frames. And then as I rock back and forward, we've actually smoothed out that motion quite a bit. I can do the same then with the next frame, adding a new keyframe and dragging the monkey, but as you can see, he's stretching quite a bit in the next frame, so I can actually start to do that with the monkey in this frame as well. So we're sort of also aiding the exaggeration in the motion. So we can rock back and forward to make sure that the motion feels right. And I'm going to create a duplicate of this first keyframe of the monkey coming in on the screen and just kind of throw him off the screen a little bit more so that he really is sort of appearing out of nowhere. And now we play through the animation, and every time we come to a double, we can see if it's something that we can use to extend our animation with. Now in this section, it's a little trickier to do because we have an immediate before and immediate after he hits the ground. So what we can do is in the immediate before, drag it back a little bit, add a duplicate keyframe, and bring it down even more, but this time begin the squash. So I'm actually going to start to squash this stretched animation, and it's going to look very odd to us because we know what we're looking at, but that's okay because really we're just trying to trick the viewer. So if I remove my onion skin, you can see that it's sort of a halfway point between them. It's not perfect, but it doesn't have to be. One thing I do want to change though is the tail, because it's a bit flat and he's starting to hit the ground, so it should start to curve. So I'm going to copy the tail from the impact and paste it on the layer of the monkey starting to hit the ground and just drag it and skew it up. So then when we rock down between them, we can see the tail starting to respond to that motion. Again, creating a duplicate keyframe after this bounce, where I stretch the body out a little bit and skew it to angle his butt in the other direction, so that when I rock between them, we can see his body bouncing off in that direction. And it's quite funny how it's such an easy process, but we're really adding a lot of smoothing to this animation. Same thing, duplicate keyframe. This time I'm using my smear again. Next keyframe is duplicated, bringing it across between the two frames, and so on and so forth. Every now and then you'll want to turn off your onion skin and just scroll back through the frames just to make sure everything is sort of flowing in the right direction and we're getting a smooth motion. And you might even want to go back to the start and just play and see how it feels. And already you can see how much smoother that beginning motion is, and we haven't redrawn anything. We haven't created any new in-betweens or anything like that, which is really cool because when we were talking about how important it is to streamline the process, this is one of those things that saves a lot of time, creates a lot of polish. And if we didn't do this, if we did it in the traditional way, we would be doing double the work. And when it took us 4 hours or more to do the line work and colouring of these frames, to do double that work is unnecessary. So this is a really useful way to cut back on that workload. Here is an example where I can manipulate the body to complement the motion to fit with the squash more, because at the moment we have the animation smears in the limbs. So I'm just making sure they move in the right direction, and I'm going to then make the squash bounce back up a little bit and in the direction that he's then going to be bouncing, and I'm just going to check that that motion works well. Bounce up. Okay, cool. I'm happy with that. Now back to my onion skin and back to my manual frame manipulation. So what has happened here with the legs, if I remove my onion skin to show you, is that we have this back leg moving in this upwards direction and then immediately down. And we actually don't want that to happen. We want to complement the motion that we've already established. So I'm going to simply select this leg and drag it down. And I can do so for the rest of the body, hiding the tail, sort of skew it in and downwards just to make sure that that motion is respected. So going back and forth, and that's a little bit better. I can actually edit these legs and raise them a bit to make sure it's nice and smooth. But that is a lot better compared to what was happening before. The legs are sort of flowing in one continuous direction. So taking it frame by frame once again, creating a duplicate keyframe. Over the next frame I want to rotate and move between the two frame positions, and flipping between the frames just to make sure it's a smooth transition, and continuing onwards. So there's a situation here where when he hits the ground, we have this solid stop. This is the next sort of motion tweak that I like to do. The first, I'll recap, is this. Smooth out that motion, and you can see how much smoother that animated motion is without really doing very much more work. The next bit is adding some follow through or squash and stretch without redrawing frames. So for example, we have the monkey hit the ground and then stop solid. The reality is if something hits the ground, it doesn't immediately stop. So what we're going to do is simulate a squash and stretch, or a bit of a bounce for when he hits the ground, by creating a duplicate keyframe later on to return to, and then in our first frame when he hits the ground, squash it down, widen the body a bit as well. On the next keyframe, just stretch it back up a little bit, skew it back a bit, and on the next keyframe, perhaps 2 frames later, I'll turn on my onion skin and stretch it out to be exactly between the position of the last frame and the previous frame. And now when I play through here, it's added some bounce. In fact, I'm going to remove the extension here and just bring the bounce in so it all happens a bit faster. And it looks a little bit intense when I'm zoomed in. It looks like he's flatter. But when I zoom out to the screen size, it actually adds some impact to the collision. Next, I actually want to extend the motion here because I feel like he sits up a bit too immediately. So I'm stretching out the duration between when he lands and when he sits up. And then when he sits up, I'm just going to check and see if I can do this tweak between the 2 frames on either side. So there's not really anything I can do between there, so I won't add a duplicate keyframe. On the next frame, I believe there is slightly, so I'm just going to stretch up. The reality is, even if the difference is only fairly minute, it still is better than nothing in a way, because if it's on doubles, there's absolutely no difference for that entire duration between the 2 frames. Whereas if we're just sort of adding a little bit of motion aiding the direction that is soon following, it's just helping that along in a way that wouldn't be otherwise. So even though what I've done here with the duplicate frames between the transitions is minute, it's still aiding the motion. There is an area here, of course, I've forgotten to colour in the eyelids, so I'm going to go through and fill those in, but then I'm going to go back and then see if I can do some of my mid-frame transition stuff. Stretching it out and making sure that the main areas to be focused on and remain the same are, such as the hands and legs being positioned in the same place. Otherwise the head can sort of be somewhere between the 2. So here's another example of an area that needs a tweak. When he sits up, he immediately sits bolt upright and there is no bounce back at all. So I'm going to extend this last keyframe to separate the one before his landing, just to give it a little bit of distance. And now I'm going to convert this head to a symbol, which is a function that most animation programs that do this sort of thing have an equivalent of. And I'm going to call this swaying head. And I'm going to call the body swaying body. And I'm going to create a duplicate keyframe of both of these frames about 7 or 8 frames later. But then at the very beginning, on the first frame, I'm going to bring the head down quite a lot, and I'm going to skew the body to be in the direction of the head facing forwards. So we have the head sort of bouncing forwards and then rearing back. I'm going to add a tween between these, and I'm going to ease out heavily to 100%. And then what happens is we get this look that he's swinging forward, picking up momentum, and then bam, he bounces and lands and ends up sitting in an upright position. But it shows momentum building, and then it shows him bouncing after hitting that position, which adds a lot of weight to his motion, which is something we really want to communicate when we refine our motions. Now I feel like the shaking head animation is a little too drawn out and long, so I'm just going to check and see what it looks like on singles instead of doubles. So I'm just dragging all of these frames in, and okay, so I way prefer that. I know it's quite extreme, but I do want to add a lot of drama to this. So I'm going to drag that all the way back so it's right next to when he rears back, and then we have this much more rapid head shake before he looks forward. So it's like he's snapping himself awake. I am adding a slight distance of frames, making the last 2 head shake frames on doubles, just so it slows down very slightly before he rears forward. And then in the area before he shakes his head, I'm going to extend the frame duration, and I'm going to add in 2 duplicate keyframes of the head and body, one at the end and one in the middle. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to add a sway. Speaking of which, I'm going to create a keyframe out of the tail, and I'm going to call it swaying tail. And I'm going to move the pivot point of the tail down to the base of the tail. Now I should have done this for the body and the head, and it's not too late to do it, so I'm just going to remove my initial tween and do that now. The reason I'm removing my initial tween is because if you move the pivot point of a symbol, it doesn't move that pivot point on every keyframe of that symbol, and then it can sort of warp the animation a bit. So I've just gotten rid of the animation, and I'm going to copy and paste these keyframes on all of the duplicate keyframes that I've created. And now the pivot points are correct. So I can recreate this animation quite simply by skewing in the position that I had before, and adding a tween and easing it out, and then making sure that looks alright, and that does exactly what I want it to. And now what I'm going to do with this central keyframe duplicate is move the head forward as if he's sort of lulling his head about a bit, and tweak his body forward as well. And I just want to make sure everything's in line with the motion, so it's just in a smooth arc without looking like he's bending over or anything like that. Just flipping back and forwards until I'm happy with the start and end position. Don't want the body to come up or anything. Alright, I'm happy with that. I'm going to add a tween between these 2 frames. And at the moment that looks a bit silly. But what I'm going to do is add another duplicate keyframe for both of the head and body layers in between the start and middle, and then the middle and the end. And then I'm going to add some secondary motion to the head. So as it's moving forward, I want the top of the head to be dragging behind, and then as he's moving back, I want the top of the head to be dragging forwards. The reason for this is it creates a bit of a drunk sway. Now, if I ease in and out, and then ease in, that being in the first half of the second half of the animation, and then the second half of the second half, ease out, then I have an ease and an ease, and we get this little motion like he's a bit drunk. Now I'm actually going to extend the duration of the end section here, just so it starts off faster and it gets a bit slower, and that adds a bit of accentuation to the motion of the sway of the head. And then we're making the most of this section where he's shaking his head and sort of lulling about a bit. I do want to make something of the tail though, because at the moment it's doing nothing. So I'm just going to simply create a duplicate keyframe at the end of that motion, and in the middle, just skew it out slightly and add a tween between them, easing out on both of those motions. And now when I play, it just has a little something there. I don't want it to be too symmetrical though, so I can actually just drag it forward so that it starts off faster and ends slower, quite like the head lolling back and forward. And then when he's shaking his head, I want the tail to do something as well. I want it to stick out like this with an ease out, and let's see how that looks. And I'll maybe have it bounce back into its previous position, easing out again. So we have this sort of reacting tail as he moves about. So he sits up, bounces, we have that motion swaying in and out like that, and then he shakes his head, his tail reacts, and then of course we get into our next motion. Now we need to smooth this motion out like we've done with our rest of our motions. So we have him reaching forward, bam, and then sort of bouncing back. So as we've done previously, I'm going to add a duplicate keyframe between these two, and then I'm going to add a keyframe at the end and then smooth out the motion between those two frames as well. So I've added in 2 duplicate keyframes, and that just smooths out that end transition. I'm going to add one last one so that just before I can have it a tiny little bit out, and that means it slows down quite a bit, and I'm going to move those frames to be on doubles. Now I know I'm moving quite fast through this. I guess it's because it's all quite second nature to me, but I hope I'm sort of communicating the process effectively here. And you can almost see too with the frames themselves that they're all on singles, the motion is smooth, we're creating a weighted motion. The 2 main aspects of the tweaks that I'm doing at the moment are creating duplicates between the doubles of keyframes and tweaking them so that they're somewhere in the middle. And then the second type is sort of adding the weighted bounces after collisions, which is something I don't really do by hand in frame by frame animation unless it's a very direct impact or it follows through into another section of animation. So we have him shake his head, face forward. I'm happy with that bounce. I do want to smooth out the motion here between him arching back, and I want him to pause when he's at the back a little longer to add some impact to his anticipation wind up. So adding a duplicate keyframe, stretching out between them, and then we have the anticipation stop. I don't want it to stop immediately, so I'm going to add another duplicate keyframe and just tweak it to be a little bit earlier, and then extend that frame once so that we have it sort of slow down and then stop. And then he very immediately jumps into the next section, so I'm going to drag that out again and sort of smooth that motion out even if slightly. And then we have, bam, him leaning forward. So I'm happier with that now. I want there to be a longer pause between when he's looking and then when he kicks up and stands up. So after extending those frames, I'm now up to my last section of motion tweaks. So how can we smooth this out? This one's a bit trickier. And it's not as important to do as the other ones because the motion is so intense that it shows itself off a bit. There are some sections that might work. For example, in here, let's see what that looks like. I can sort of rotate and skew that a bit to be halfway between them, like that. But the problem is the hands get a bit out of whack. So to fix this, I'm going to turn off my onion skin. I'm going to hide my tail, and I'm going to select the hands. I'm going to select them all the way back to the root of the body and manipulate them. And just stretch them out and anchor them to the ground, and then turn back on my onion skin and make sure I position them in the right place. So when I'm happy with that, rock back and forward, and that is a pretty adequate sort of fake in between. Going to do the same again here with this frame if possible. We're sort of getting a bit of a scrunched up look. I'm going to skew the legs forward a lot and really squash the body like this. And let's see what this looks like in context. So I'll turn off the onion skin, rock back and forward, and I think that works pretty well. Now once again we get to our second type of motion tweak, which is adding some bounce to our immediate stop. So I'm going to duplicate the keyframe later along the line, and in this first keyframe bring it in and skew it across, then next bring it up and skew it out a bit, then next turn on the onion skin and move it up and out, but between the two, and then add some frame duration between that and the very end, so it sort of gradually comes to a stop. And then finally we have the kick forward, so I'm going to move that back so we have a little bit more space there. And for example, in terms of alluding to the motion or aiding the motion, I don't need to find a way to manipulate these one of these two frames to be exactly in the middle. What I can simply do is create a duplicate keyframe of this first frame and just skew it and raise it in that direction. And this is alluding to the fact that he's sort of moving towards that motion, and then bam, we have the huge stretch and squash motions happening. I can then continue to do my manipulation of the frames that I'm using here, skewing and squashing and stretching until they fit somewhere in the middle. And then we get to our last couple of frames. I'm going to squash the body down even more. And then our very last motion tweak is when he lands on the ground. There is something that I've neglected to do, and that is the fact that I had the tail layer off when I've been making these manipulations. So that's slightly embarrassing. So I'm just going to have to go through and edit that now and make sure that they're tweaked and somewhere in the middle. And then finally we reach the end here. Sorry about that little mistake there. And then I'm going to add a final little bit of bounce to our last frame here. And I'm simply going to do that by moving this middle duplicate keyframe that I've added and just dragging it between these two frames. And then on the very end frame, I'm going to create a duplicate 2 frames later, and then on the frame previous just skew it slightly out. And now that should add some bounce that softens the blow a little bit. And that, ladies and gentlemen, should be finished. So I'm going to play it from the beginning and see how that feels. That seems to be a lot smoother. Everything is on singles for the most part. We sort of cheated to achieve that, but we get the exact same effect, and it's very satisfying, and we have a lot more impact to the physicality of the motion of our character with our little bounces and our slowing down to stops and accelerating into movement. And that brings us to the conclusion of our entire frame-by-frame section, where we created a fairly intense action-driven character motion. So I hope that through these tutorials, though they have been lengthy, have provided enough detail and insight for you to be able to apply some of these principles of animation and techniques to your own animations. Thanks for joining and supporting my work, and I'll see you in the other